You look at this person, DLB, right? And he's built these 4 really distinct identities. Dante East, a Daniels vision, Dylan Bates. Each one seems to hold a different piece of him. Confession, art, philosophy. He actually calls it deliberate fragmentation.
And when you see that kind of structure, that self-aware architecture someone's built just to survive psychologically, well, it makes the official categories, the neat little boxes of mental distress, feel pretty inadequate, doesn't it?
Totally inadequate.
It just immediately throws that whole clinical idea of a perfectly unified self into question. The thing that diagnostic manuals often seem to assume.
Right. If someone's whole way of getting through, surviving serious bipolar, PTSD, and AVPD depends on decentralizing who they are, using these fragments as like shields and even a creative outlet, how can we then turn around and say, nope, you need to fit back into this box? It feels like we're just diagnosing the survival mechanism itself, not the original wound.
That's it, exactly. That's the fundamental tension we're diving into here.
Yeah.
You've got the formal language, the clinical codes, the checklists, trying to define and contain everything.
Yeah, the official narrative.
And then you've got the actual messy, tangled reality of being human, shaped so much by trauma, and often made worse by systems that are supposed to help but fail. So our job here is to look under those labels, find the hidden connections, the architecture linking personal suffering to those bigger systemic failures.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this identity architecture as survival, starting with that avoidance piece, because DLB's system, it's not just playing roles, right? It's like a specific machine for handling the emotional weight.
It's absolutely a map born out of sheer necessity. If the core self tries to hold all that pain, it shatters.
Right.
So maybe Dante East is the public face, the one dealing with the world. DLB is the raw inner stuff, the confessions, the philosophy. It's layered. It's not delusion. It's what can happen when trauma is so overwhelming that you have to distribute the load just to keep going.
Functioning depends on fragmenting.
Precisely. Your ability to function hinges on your ability to fragment.
And one of the deep-seated issues driving this kind of defense is avoidant personality disorder, AVPD. Avoidance sounds, well, it sounds kind of mild, doesn't it? Like just being shy or making a social choice. But the research digs much deeper. It shows the roots are way more complex, more foundational than something like social phobia.
Oh, absolutely. For years, academics have debated this. Are AVPD and social phobia, or SP, really different things? Or is AVPD just, SP dialed way, way up? Generalized social anxiety to the extreme.
They definitely share features, fear of criticism, pulling back from social situations.
Yeah, the clinical picture overlaps. But when you dig into the causes, the etiology, that's where you find a clear separation. It changes the whole game.
Okay, how so?
We know they share a lot of the same genetic groundwork. There's a shared predisposition, which is significant.
Right, the genetic hardware is similar.
Yes, but, and this is where the unseen story really comes out, the environmental factors, the things that actually trigger these conditions. They were found to be unique, completely uncorrelated between AVPD and SP.
Whoa. Okay, so same genes, but different environmental triggers switch them on.
Exactly. So if the genetic potential is there, but totally different life experiences flip the switch, you're fundamentally looking at two different conditions. The crucial difference isn't just biology, it's those invisible wounds from childhood.
And for AVPD, that invisible architect, it's neglect.
Precisely. The research points very clearly to childhood neglect as a specific, distinct risk factor for AVPD. And, digging into the details here really matters for understanding healing.
How specific?
The link was strongest specifically for physical neglect.
Physical neglect. So not necessarily the big dramatic traumas like abuse or violence that people often focus on. We're talking about the absence of something.
Yes. The silent maltreatment, that persistent, grinding lack of being seen, of being cared for, of being protected physically during childhood.
Like basic needs for comfort, safety, just physical security not being met.
Exactly. Not overt abuse, but that constant lack. And that connection between physical neglect and AVPD held up even when researchers accounted for things like child abuse or a child's innate temperament.
That's critical. It's the lack of something essential that fundamentally shapes the adult personality structure.
It's the relentless message that your physical needs, your very presence, your emotional reality, they just don't warrant attention or protection. If your caregivers consistently make you feel invisible,
you internalize that. You start believing you're inherently unworthy of care.
And that belief system, that relational history, gets woven right into your adult identity. It's not just about low self-esteem. It dictates your whole script for interacting with people. ABPD grows out of those less traumatic, those silent experiences.
So the avoidance makes perfect, tragic sense.
It's a logical defense. Why would you put a self you've learned is unworthy out there, risking rejection? Avoidance becomes a necessity, a structural defense protecting a core that's been hollowed out by inadequacy.
Which completely reframes DLB's functional avoidance, doesn't it? His fragmentation, his need to avoid. It's less about being scared of a party and more like this complex, calculated strategy to protect that core self, the one the world failed to see and protect early on.
The AVPD is a pattern basically etched in by environmental failure
Yeah.
and that kind of chronic emotional strain, that pattern of structural defense. It leads us straight into the really extreme end of the spectrum, bipolar disorder specifically, which often shows up alongside these personality challenges.
Okay, let's map out that clinical territory first, because bipolar gets thrown around a lot, maybe too loosely. We need to be clear about bipolar I versus bipolar II.
Right. The official definition for bipolar I really hinges on the manic episode. You need at least one full-blown manic episode.
Define full-blown.
It's a distinct period lasting at least a week, or bad enough to need hospitalization, where your mood is abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or even really irritable, plus increased energy activity.
Okay. Big disruptive energy. Major depressive episodes might happen, might not, but the mania is key for bipolar I.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with bipolar II. People often think it's milder, but that's misleading.
How so?
Bipolar II requires a history of hypomanic episodes. These are less severe, shorter bursts of elevated mood and energy than full mania. They don't usually require hospitalization, and crucially, at least one major depressive episode.
Ah, okay. So hypomania plus major depression is the requirement for bipolar II.
Yes. And here's what's really striking, and often missed when people talk about severity. While bipolar I might seem more severe because mania can lead to hospitalization.
Yeah, the acute crisis grabs attention.
Right. But the data suggests that depressive episodes in bipolar II can actually be more frequent and last much longer, sometimes persisting in waves throughout a person's life.
That changes the whole picture of burden, doesn't it? Bipolar I is maybe like acute high-intensity explosions requiring immediate intervention. But bipolar II, the depressive side, sounds like the slow, grinding, relentless suffering, a kind of chronic, low-grade war that maybe the system doesn't notice as easily because it's not always landing people in the hospital.
It really highlights the immense weight of the depressive side of the illness. People with bipolar II can spend way more time battling debilitating depression than they ever spend in hypomania.
And when you look at the ultimate cost of this chronic struggle, well, there's that mortality statistic. It's just, it's a shocking indictment of how we're handling this.
It is. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah, I want to pause on this because it's huge. Research linking bipolar disorder to a higher risk of early death than smoking. I mean, that's astronomical. Is that purely down to the increased suicide risk, which we know is tragically high, or is there more going on? Like physical health stuff the system just isn't connecting?
That's such a critical question. Suicide is definitely a major factor, no doubt, but that statistic reflects something broader, a more systemic issue. People with bipolar disorder have much higher rates of serious physical health problems: cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic syndrome.
Why?
It's complex. Partly lifestyle factors during mood episodes, maybe poor self-care during depression, risky behavior during mania, but also potentially side effects from long-term medications. Plus, the chronic stress and inflammation associated with the disorder itself takes a toll on the body.
So the system is diagnosing the mind.
But often failing to treat the whole person. The body is suffering too, and the care is fragmented. We treat the mental illness here, the physical illness over there.
And that fragmentation allows these physical comorbidities to just spiral, leading to that increased mortality risk.
It seems likely. It's an indictment of fragmented medicine, absolutely.
And this failure, this complexity, it gets even worse when you factor in the other conditions that almost always seem to travel with bipolar disorder. Comorbidity, especially anxiety.
The numbers are really high.
Staggering, yeah.
Yeah. We're looking at least half, maybe 50–60% lifetime rate of people with bipolar disorder also developing an anxiety disorder.
And not just one type.
No, all kinds are common. Generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety, they frequently co-occur with BD.
And this isn't just like having two separate problems side by side. the anxiety messes with the bipolar itself, right?
Completely. It's not just an add-on. They interact in really negative ways. It makes for a significantly tougher clinical picture.
Ow.
Comorbid anxiety impacts the presentation, makes the mood swings maybe look more chaotic or unstable. It
Damn.
affects the course, often linked to more frequent mood episodes like rapid cycling. It worsens the outcome, making recovery harder. And it complicates treatment. Medications might not work as well, or side effects become trickier. It just makes managing the whole thing fundamentally harder.
So trying to get a clear count of how many people are dealing with this bipolar anxiety combo must be difficult. The data seems all over the place.
It really is. You see these wildly different rates in studies. Some big population surveys find huge percentages, like nearly everyone with bipolar also has anxiety symptoms.
Like 89 to 100%.
Yeah, those kinds of numbers pop up in epidemiological surveys using leg interviewers in the general population. They cast a wide net, catching maybe milder or undiagnosed cases.
Okay.
But then clinical samples, people already getting treatment report lower rates, maybe more like 40 or 50%.
So the difference is basically how you're counting and who you're counting.
Largely, yes. Different methodologies explain a lot of the variation. It just underscores how hard it is to get an official number for suffering that often exists outside or on the fringes of the formal healthcare system.
And that complexity, that sort of chaos in how it presents, it continues when you look at the really severe forms like rapid cycling bipolar.
Right. Rapid cycling bipolar, that's usually defined as having 4 or more distinct mood episodes: mania, hypomania, depression, or mixed, within a single year. It's notoriously difficult to treat.
And what drives that? Is it just bad luck, or are there mechanisms?
There's this concept called a sensitization process. The idea is that each mood episode might kind of prime the brain, making it more vulnerable or sensitive to future episodes. Like the threshold for instability gets lower over time.
Okay, kindling effect.
Sort of, yeah. And here's where it connects back directly to the system of care and potential problems within it. Some of the risk factors identified for developing this more severe rapid cycling pattern, they're related to treatment itself.
Wait, treatment can make it worse?
Potentially. The studies point to a few key risk factors. Things like thyroid dysfunction, having an underlying cyclothymic temperament, which is like a milder chronic mood cycling, and antidepressant use.
Antidepressants, but aren't those supposed to help the depression side of bipolar?
That's the huge critical question. Antidepressants are standard treatment for major depression, and often used for bipolar depression too. But there's evidence suggesting that in some vulnerable individuals with bipolar disorder, antidepressants might actually trigger mania or hypomania, or worse, contribute to developing that rapid cycling pattern over the long term.
So trying to fix one symptom, depression, might inadvertently destabilize the whole system in the long run for some people.
It's a potential risk, a therapeutic paradox. It highlights the danger of treating a complex, cyclical illness based purely on the symptom checklist from the manual, without considering the whole dynamic system.
Which forces us, really, to put the manual itself under the microscope, the DSM-5. We have to question how useful, how authoritative it really is in these complex cases.
Well, the official narrative of the DSM is quite clear about its purpose. It says it's a tool designed to help trained clinicians diagnose people for treatment, for public health tracking, for research. It summarizes syndromes, patterns of symptoms to point towards an underlying disorder.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
There's a huge caveat baked right into the manual itself, one that often gets glossed over.
Which is?
The DSM explicitly states that the symptom lists alone don't define the disorders comprehensively. It says clinical judgment is essential to figure out when symptoms cross the line from, quote, normal ranges into a disorder.
That's the system admitting its own limits, its own subjectivity, right there in the fine print.
It's an admission of inherent instability. And that's exactly where groups like the Critical Psychiatry Network jump in. They see that instability and they question the very foundation.
What's their main argument? It sounds like a fundamental challenge to the whole system.
It is. Their core critique is structural. They argue that many psychiatric diagnoses has what's called poor construct validity.
Okay, break down construct validity for us.
Sure. Imagine you have a scale that's supposed to measure only weight. But it turns out it's also affected by the room's temperature and the barometric pressure. That scale doesn't have good construct validity because it's not reliably measuring the single thing weight it claims to measure.
Got it.
The Critical Psychiatry Network argues that psychiatric diagnoses are often like that scale. They're checklists of symptoms, mood, anxiety, behavior patterns all lumped together. But they don't necessarily measure a single, real, underlying biological thing consistently. They're descriptive labels, not necessarily biological facts.
And if the labels themselves are shaky, if they lack that solid validity, then what does that mean for the treatments based on those labels?
Exactly. It leads directly to skepticism about the primary treatments, especially the chemical ones: mood stabilizers, antidepressants, antipsychotics. If the diagnosis isn't reliably pointing to a specific biological problem, how sure can we be that the biological fix is the right one or the only one?
So they challenge the heavy reliance on psychopharmacology.
Yes, they question whether it should be the first or sometimes only solution offered. Instead, they advocate for a shift in focus, promoting things like meaning, personal narrative, understanding relationships, basically, the subjective human experience over just checking off symptoms from a list.
This feels like the system finally trying to catch up with the kind of human reality we see in DLB's story. With his deliberate fragmentation, it feels like a move away from seeing the mind as just a machine that's broken.
It really does. The purely biomedical model, which really took hold around 1980 with DSM-3, seems to be losing its dominance. We're seeing a clear trend now towards what's being called a person-centered biopsychosocial spiritual model.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but it signifies a major shift. It recognizes that your environment, your trauma history, your relationships, your lived experience, that's not just background noise. It's central to understanding what's wrong and how to heal. It's a paradigm shift happening right now.
And speaking of environment and lived experience, we have to circle back to that huge invisible wound, neglect. Because the way the official system codes neglect, that reveals the ultimate structural silence, the ultimate failure of that checklist model.
This is where we need to follow the architecture of power, the coding itself. We established earlier that neglect, especially physical neglect, is a powerful cause, an etiological factor for AVPD.
Right. It builds the foundation for that avoidance.
Yet, look where the DSM-5 puts the codes for child physical neglect or child emotional neglect, codes like Z62.812. They're tucked away under this category called other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention.
Other conditions, like problems with housing or unemployment, it's not listed as a core mental disorder itself.
No, it's framed as an external problem that a clinician might want to pay attention to.
Think about the implications of that, the structural consequence.
It's profound. By classifying neglect, that experience of not being seen, not being protected, as just a potential focus or an external problem, rather than a disorder stemming from trauma.
The system structurally separates the cause from the effect. It separates the failure of care, often institutional or familial, from the psychiatric injury that results.
Exactly. The system said, okay, we'll treat your AVPD, but it structurally minimizes or even ignores the foundational trauma, the neglect that created the need for that avoidant defense in the first place. It ends up treating the symptom, the alarm, but ignores the fire.
It treats the defense structure, but denies the original injury that made the defense necessary. It's like refusing to officially code the arsonist while treating the smoke inhalation.
And this pattern, this historical tendency to downplay structural causes, it echoes in that massive physical reorganization of mental health care that happened decades ago. Deinstitutionalization.
Right, the big shift away from the old asylums. Most people think that happened just because new drugs came along, the antipsychotics like Thorazine in the 50s.
That's the common story, the official narrative. And the drugs certainly played a role. They made community living possible for more people. But they weren't the only driver, not by a long shot.
So what else was pushing it? It wasn't purely a clinical decision based on better treatment?
No. It was heavily driven by cold, hard, structural incentives, legal mandates, and crucially, money. It was, in many ways, a financial policy decision dressed up as medical progress.
Okay, follow the money. How did finances drive deinstitutionalization?
The key piece of architecture here was something called the Medicaid Institutions for Mental Disease Exclusion, the IMD exclusion.
IMD exclusion. What did that do?
Basically, federal legislation was passed that prevented states from using federal Medicaid funds to pay for the care of most adults, age 21 to 65, who are living in large psychiatric hospitals or other institutions for mental disease.
Wait, so the federal government essentially stopped paying the bills for long-term inpatient psychiatric care for the bulk of the adult population.
That's the core of it. Suddenly, states had a massive financial incentive not to keep people in state hospitals because they wouldn't get federal reimbursement for it, but they could get federal matching funds for community-based services.
So the money flow dictated the care flow. Changes in funding codes literally force states to shift people out of institutions and towards community settings, whether those settings were fully ready or not.
Precisely. The system responded primarily to the financial incentive structure, not just to what was clinically best in every case. The structure of funding determined the structure of care.
And then the legal system cemented that shift. You mentioned the Olmsted decision.
Yes, the 1999 Supreme Court decision in Olmsted v. That was a landmark ruling. It essentially said that public entities have to provide community-based services for people with disabilities, including mental illness, when those services are appropriate, when the affected people don't oppose it, and when it can be reasonably accommodated.
What was the basis for that ruling?
It cited the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. The court ruled that unnecessary segregation of people with disabilities in institutions when community placement is viable is a form of discrimination prohibited by the ADA.
So keeping someone institutionalized when they could live in the community with support was ruled a violation of their civil rights, like unlawful segregation.
Exactly. It provided a strong legal mandate pushing towards community integration. So you had the financial pressure from the IMD exclusion and then the legal pressure from Olmsted.
It forced the system's hand even further. The physical landscape of mental health care today, fewer long-term beds, more community centers, wasn't just shaped by medicine, but profoundly by these financial codes and legal rulings.
The location of care was determined by money and law, alongside clinical factors. The structure we have now is a direct legacy of those decisions.
Which brings us back to the critical question. If the physical location of care was shaped so heavily by funding codes and legal mandates, what financial or structural incentive currently prevents the system from recognizing historical trauma, like childhood neglect, as the primary official codable diagnosis it so often seems to be? The system clearly responds to codes, and the codes for these foundational traumas remain structurally marginalized, hidden in that other conditions category. Why?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Perhaps acknowledging neglect or trauma as a primary diagnosis would imply a level of societal or systemic responsibility that the current structure isn't set up to handle, financially or legally. It's easier to code the resulting individual disorder, like AVPD or PTSD, than it is to code the potentially systemic failure that caused it.
And that structural silence, that refusal to code the root cause appropriately, means the specific kinds of help needed, the trauma-informed, personalized interventions, often remain underfunded and hard to get.
Precisely. Which leads us to where healing is actually happening, often despite the system's limitations. It's heading towards highly personalized approaches, both psychological and pharmacological.
All right, let's talk about those personalized interventions. We know therapy can work, especially for personality disorders.
Absolutely. There's strong evidence for specialized therapies. Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, for instance, has a ton of empirical support, particularly for borderline personality disorder, which often involves intense emotional dysregulation.
But for the cluster C disorders, like the avoidant personality disorder we link to neglect, the therapy needs a different focus, right? It's not about dysregulation in the same way.
Exactly. For AVPD, the approach often needs to be a modified form of DDT. Standard DBT works heavily on managing emotions that feel out of control, the extreme highs and lows.
Okay.
Modified DBT for AVPD, however, shifts the focus. It targets the emotional over-control, the excessive inhibition, and the cognitive rigidity that developed as defenses against expected rejection or criticism.
So you're directly targeting that protective shell, the one built because of the neglect experience.
You got it. For someone whose core wound is invisibility and lack of protection, the main challenge isn't being too emotional, it's being too guarded, too inhibited. Their whole structure is built on risk aversion, hypersensitivity to judgment.
So how does modified DBT try to break that script?
A key concept is radical openness.
Radical openness. Okay, that sounds like the polar opposite of avoidance and fragmentation.
It is. It's about cultivating the willingness to experience reality as it is, including difficult emotions and social situations, without resorting to the old avoidance patterns. It's about learning to be seen, embracing the possibility of vulnerability, maybe even criticism, in order to finally achieve genuine connection and integrate those fragmented parts.
It's a fundamental rewiring of that childhood script.
Completely. You contrast it with, say, some cluster B patterns where maybe the philosophy is the ends justify the means acting out to get needs met. Cluster C, like AVPD, is all about inhibition, self-protection, hiding. The therapy has to disrupt that hypervigilance, teach the person that vulnerability doesn't always lead to catastrophe, that they can tolerate relational risk.
So that's one path. Hyper-personalized psychological therapy, focusing on relational history, narrative, emotional patterns.
Oh, yeah.
And on the other path, we have pharmacology racing towards biological precision, driven by genetics and neuroscience.
Yeah, the biological understanding is accelerating incredibly fast. We've now pinpointed nearly 300 specific gene locations linked to bipolar disorder.
300.
Wow. And what's fascinating is that many of these genetic locations overlap with genes associated with schizophrenia and major depression.
So the neat diagnostic boundaries blur even at the genetic level.
It strongly suggests a complex, interconnected biological web rather than totally separate disease entities. It reinforces the argument against relying solely on those distinct DSM categories.
Okay, so as the genetic map gets clearer, what's actually changing in terms of drug development? Are we seeing genuinely new approaches for bipolar, especially for that difficult depressive phase?
Definitely moving beyond just lithium and the older meds. The pipeline for 2025 and beyond is focused on novel targets, particularly for bipolar depression, which, as we said, is often the most persistent part of the illness.
Give us some examples. What does that biological precision look like in practice?
Well, there's Blixperdil. It's an NMDA receptor antagonist, kind of related to how ketamine works, aiming for rapid antidepressant effects.
Okay, fast relief.
Then you have agents like ALTO-100. This one is designed to boost hippocampal neurogenesis, basically, encouraging the growth of new brain cells in the hippocampus, a key area for mood and memory. The idea is to target the cognitive dulling that often comes with chronic depression.
Interesting. Targeting brain repair, essentially.
And another one is navicrant. It works on the kappa-opioid receptor system, which is involved in the brain's stress and reward pathways. The goal there is to alleviate depressive symptoms by modulating that internal stress response.
So it's getting incredibly specific, targeting particular receptors, brain growth, stress pathways.
Exactly. One path is diving deep into brain structure and biology, seeking precise chemical interventions. The other is diving deep into personal history and relational dynamics, seeking precise psychological interventions.
Both paths seem to be converging on hyper-personalization, moving away from the one-size-fits-all checklist approach.
Which implicitly acknowledges that the generalized approach just hasn't been sufficient for many people.
And right in the middle of all this complexity, the systemic issues, the biological breakthroughs, the psychological nuances, you've got the average person trying to figure themselves out, often starting with social media.
Ah, yes, the social media gateway paradox.
It's a paradox, right? Because on one hand, platforms like TikTok, short videos, they are undeniably helping people, reducing shame, giving people language for their experiences, making them realize they're not alone. It can be a crucial first step, a gateway to seeking actual help.
It absolutely provides that moment of recognition. Hey, that sounds like me,
Yeah.
which can be incredibly validating and motivating,
Yeah.
giving voice to suffering that might have felt invisible.
There's a big but.
There has to be. That flash of insight you get from a 60-second video, that is not therapy.
Yeah.
It's not a diagnosis. It's not a treatment plan.
Real healing, sustained change,
Yeah.
that takes so much more. It needs proper assessment, looking at the whole person, their full reality. It means moving from that online flicker of curiosity to real-life clarity, ideally within a safe, structured professional relationship that can actually integrate all these complex factors, the biology, the history, the environment.
Yeah. If the mind's architecture is this hidden, complex thing, shaped by neglect and systemic forces, then the repair work has to be equally thoughtful, equally personalized. We started with DLB's deliberate fragmentation as survival. The goal ultimately has to be moving beyond needing fragmentation towards integrated, trauma-informed care and maybe eventually that radical openness.
So let's try to wrap this up for you, the listener, navigating your own experiences. What we're seeing is this huge disconnect. The official system, the DSM, uses rigid codes, checklists. It often struggles to capture the real weight of chronic depression or the deep impact of wounds like neglect. But at the same time, the philosophy of treatment is shifting dramatically. It's moving towards narrative, towards trauma, towards the individual's unique story. And that shift is being validated from both sides by the need for incredibly specific therapies like modified DBT and by the cutting-edge precision coming from genetics and neuroscience.
We saw how structural decisions, literally lines of code in funding laws like the IMD exclusion, determined where people physically received care for decades.
Right.
And we know that specific childhood experiences, especially that silent wound of neglect, structurally shape who we become as adults and how we function.
So if money and law dictated the location of care, What's the hidden incentive, the financial or structural block, that stops the official system from elevating historical trauma like neglect from an other condition footnote to the primary codable recognized diagnosis it so often truly is?
The label matters. In our current system, the diagnosis code is currency. It unlocks resources, dictates treatment pathways, until the system assigns the proper weight, the proper code, the proper funding to the foundational wound of trauma.
It's going to keep focusing on managing the defenses, the symptoms built around that wound, instead of truly addressing the core injury itself.
That seems to be the structural bind we're in.
This episode is powered by NeonKore Media for stories they said were too real to tell.